the things I'm about to say could be applied to any organization. They're not a criticism of the government particularly. I'll leave criticisms of the government's response until afterwards, and to leave it to people who are far better qualified than I am to know about these things, to leave it to opposition parties, to other politicians, for example. But I think there are nonetheless one or two things that have happened or haven't happened so far that are instructive for anyone who may have to be thinking of organizational crisis comms in hopefully not as big a crisis as the one that confronts governments around the world right now because of the coronavirus pandemic. And I'm going to limit myself just to three observations. And the first one is around what I call tell and show. Many people will be familiar from school days, perhaps their kids' school days, with show and tell. Well, we turn that on its head at ACM training, and we talk about tell and show. And I was reminded of this point by a colleague of mine, Carl Baldacchino, who worked many years ago for West Mercia Police when I first came in touch with him, and has since worked in lots of different places at the National Policing College, for example, and most recently at Balfour Beatty Living Places in Hereford. And he was crying out loud that the government's tell, its message at the early point of the coronavirus pandemic, was don't panic buy, don't panic. Don't panic was the tell. The show, however, was very different. The show was of empty supermarket shelves, devoid of bread and of especially toilet paper for some bizarre reason. And when there is a mismatch between what people are being told, what they're hearing with their ears, and what they're seeing with their eyes, you're asking for trouble. If you think about it, you know, we are visual creatures. We take our primary cues from what we see. And we tend to, you know, the saying, I'll only believe it if I see it. So you might have a really, really good message around don't panic. But if the pictures are saying panic, well, then people will panic. So it's important, if you're trying to manage a crisis in an organization, to, insofar as you can, make sure that the tell and the show are both going in the same direction. The second point I want to make is around the saying, actions speak louder than words. And I accept fully that in something as complex and as global as coronavirus, the words, of course, have to be ahead of the action. And no one is at this stage quite sure where the pandemic is going. It's very different to what I might call fast burn disasters, where it's all over and done with by the time that the crisis comms team start talking to stakeholders, start talking to the public. Certain things are known. In this one, there are those Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns, if you like, that are ready to bite us on the backside, perhaps unexpectedly. But nonetheless, there is a danger that if there is a too big a lag between your words, let's say, for example, talking about 100,000 tests by the end of April, and the actions not eventuating at the end of April, well, then one's credibility as a spokesperson tends to drop. People believe you less. Your key messages become harder to communicate because you're lacking a little integrity. And of course, you know, we're talking about marginal gains and reductions here, but you want to be as compelling a spokesperson for your organization as possible, and you don't want to undermine your position, your credibility, by stretching people's credulity to breaking point by having too big a lag, as I say, between the actions that you take as an organization and the words that you speak. Because again, a bit like show and tell, people believe what they see with their own eyes. People are more likely to believe the actions that you take than the words that you speak. And the final point, Eva, on crisis comms is around the terminology that we use. And right at the start of the pandemic, when we were still calling it coronavirus rather than COVID-19, I was talking to a health visitor in London whose job it was to do some of the earlier tests. And she said to me, look, the government's got the language completely wrong here. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, no one in the communities I serve understands what social distancing means or what self-isolation is. We as medics might understand them. She said, well, just go home, stay home would be a better message. The concept of home is much easier, and going home is much easier to comprehend across the spectrum, irrespective of what community you're from, than social distancing and self-isolation. And I guess the lesson for all of us here in Crisis Comms is that right at the start, and it's hard, I accept, it's important to consider very carefully the language that you're going to use, because quite quickly that language will, if you like, cement itself into the national consciousness, as social distancing and self-isolation did initially. And when something is solidified, when something has been cemented in people's minds, it's quite difficult to get rid of, although not impossible. And I notice just in the recent few days that the messaging has been much clearer on the podiums at the day in language that I think everybody can understand. So Eva, I hope that answers your question, and I hope nobody sees that as a particular criticism of the government. I'm trying to keep politics out of this insofar as I can, but I do think that in years to come, certainly people like me, clever academics, certainly not like me, I'm not an academic, but those who study these things for a living will find an awful lot of detail to pore over in organizational response to COVID-19.